Hello, thank you all for joining me. My name is Samantha Pepper, and I'm an educator at the Cincinnati Observatory. I'm very excited to partner with the Campbell County Library to bring you all this video. Now, for those of you who have never been to the observatory, I recommend you do come visit us because the observatory is one of the oldest in the country. The current observatory is located on Mount Lookout, but it's not the original observatory building. The original observatory was actually on Mount Adams, and it opened in 1845. But by the 1870s, there was so much coal smog from downtown that the astronomers actually couldn't use the telescopes, so they moved out to Mount Lookout. So the building that you guys are looking at right here opened in 1873. Now, we may not have the original building, but we do have the original telescope, our 1845 Mitchell telescope, named after our founder. Now, to me personally, this is an incredibly special scope. It is very old and it is in pristine condition. Now, the best part about it is we still use it. So most telescopes of that age are in museums, they're behind glass, you can't look at them, you can't touch them, but our telescope is still in use. Where else do you get the chance to look through a 175-year-old wooden telescope? One of my favorite things to look at through the telescope and to talk about are constellations. Now, constellations are my favorite because they combine the science of astronomy with storytelling, because people all over the world in different cultures across different time periods have made constellations. So it's something that kind of unifies us. And those constellations all have mythology behind them, which I love. I love the storytelling aspect of constellations. Now, when we talk about constellations, there's two categories we can think about. We can think about circumpolar constellations. Circumpolar constellations are those that have stars that don't set below the horizon. So that means that we can see them any time of the year. We can see them any season. They're always visible to us. And of course, for us here in the northern hemisphere, our circumpolar constellations are not going to be the same as those in the southern hemisphere. So in the other category that we can think about are seasonal constellations. So those are constellations that have stars that do set below the horizon and that we don't necessarily see all year long. So many of the zodiac constellations are seasonal. That's why they're associated with certain birth months. Now, I kind of want to quiz you guys and see if you recognize this constellation. I'm sure you all recognize it. It's very easy to see from the northern Kentucky, greater Cincinnati area. This is probably the first constellation many of us learned. It is, of course, the Big Dipper. So to us, we look at the Big Dipper and we see that collection of stars as a large ladle. And I see that. It looks very much like a ladle to me. But the interesting thing about the Big Dipper is if we were to go to different cultures or different time periods, people saw that collection of stars as something different. So if you were to travel to the Pacific Islands, many people there look up at the night sky, see the stars that make up the Big Dipper, and actually see a fishhook. And if you have children, you're probably looking at that fishhook and you recognize it as Maui's fishhook, like in the movie Moana. And you're right. So in a lot of Pacific Island traditions, the Big Dipper is actually Maui's magic fishhook that he used to pull the Hawaiian Islands up out of the ocean. Now, in medieval Germany and some other medieval European countries, they looked up and they saw the Big Dipper as a wagon being pulled by some horses. I can sort of see that one. You know, the bed of the wagon is the bowl part of the spoon, the horses are the handle. I get it. Now, one that's surprising to me is that the ancient Egyptians thought that the Big Dipper looks like a coffin. So they saw the bowl part of the spoon as being the coffin, and the handle as each individual star was a mourner following behind the coffin. So that's kind of an interesting one. And then the Inuit, far north in Canada, saw the Big Dipper as a caribou, which makes sense. They live around a lot of caribou. Now, I'm not sure where this caribou's legs are, but I can mostly see the Big Dipper as a caribou. But I hate to break your all's hearts, because the truth is, the Big Dipper isn't actually an official constellation. So in talking about the Big Dipper, I bet you guys have already figured out that the night sky can get very full. If we were to make a constellation out of every constellation that had ever been described across time, across cultures, the night sky would be incredibly full. So this organization called the International Astronomical Union decided to split the night sky into 88 official constellations. And unfortunately, the Big Dipper is not one of them. However, it is part of one of them. And the Big Dipper is still important. We can call it an asterism. So an asterism is any shape that is not part of one of those 88 officials. So you guys could go out tonight and make your own asterisms up in the night sky. And as I mentioned, the Big Dipper is part of an official constellation. Ursa Major, the Big Bear. So it's pretty easy to see the Big Dipper there. The long tail is the handle of the spoon. The bear's hip is the bowl part of the spoon. And then we add a few additional stars, and there you have it, a big bear. And you may notice that this bear has quite the long tail. And if we look at Ursa Minor, the Little Dipper, it also is a bear with quite a long tail. Now I'm going to tell you one of the many, many myths behind these two bears. It describes how they got up in the night sky and why they have such long tails. But before I do that, I want to mention that there are a lot of myths about these two because of the star that makes up the little bear's tail. So that star is Polaris, or as we more frequently call it, the North Star. And the North Star is the only star in the Northern Hemisphere that doesn't move. So it doesn't move seasonally, and it doesn't move all night long. So it doesn't matter what time or what season it is, Polaris is always due north, which makes it incredibly helpful for navigation because you don't really need to know much about the night sky. You don't really need to know where you are. If you can find Polaris, you know where north is. So Polaris historically was incredibly important to travelers, and so they made a lot of stories about it to help remember where it is in the night sky, which constellation it's a part of, so to be easy to find. So we go back to looking at those bears with their long tails. The story goes that Ursa Major was once a woman named Callisto. Now, Callisto lived in ancient Greece, and she was one of Artemis's handmaidens. Artemis was the Greek goddess of the hunt, and she was a very fierce huntress, but she had taken a vow of chastity, and she had sworn to never lie with a man, and she made all of her handmaidens vow the same thing. That wasn't a big deal to Callisto. She didn't mind. She loved Artemis. She loved being one of her many huntresses. She loved living in Artemis's sacred woods. But there was one issue, and that's because Callisto caught the notice of Zeus, the king of the gods. Now, Zeus was married to Hera, who was his sister. We'll just ignore that fact for a moment, and who was also the queen of the gods. But even though he was married, he was constantly falling in love with human maidens. And as soon as he saw Callisto, he fell in love with her, and he decided that he had to have her. So Zeus took on the guise of Artemis and went down into Artemis's sacred woods and waited for Callisto to be alone. And Zeus came up to Callisto in Artemis's form and embraced her, and then immediately turned back into his own form, and they had intimate relations. Now, Callisto was a little bit horrified because she had promised Artemis to never lay with a man, and she had broken her vow of chastity. Well, she decided she just wasn't going to tell Artemis about it. But unfortunately for Callisto, she was pregnant, and so she could only hide that from Artemis for so long. And eventually Artemis noticed that she was pregnant and became furious. She didn't care that it had been Zeus, her own father, that had taken Callisto's chastity. She decided to throw her out of her sacred woods. So Callisto was left to fend on her own. Now, luckily for Callisto, she was able to successfully give birth to her son, who she named Arcus. But unluckily for Callisto, Hera had been waiting to punish her. So Hera was always incredibly jealous of Zeus's infidelities. Even though it happened all of the time, she was often very spiteful and punished the women that Zeus cheated on her with. And Callisto was no exception. So Hera decided that she was going to turn Callisto into a bear. Now, poor Callisto has this newborn baby that she can't care for. So Zeus comes and takes Arcus and gives him to another family to raise. So Callisto is forced to live in the woods, avoid the hunters so that she doesn't get killed, and Arcus is brought up by another family. Now, luckily, Arcus grows up strong, he grows up brave, but he has no idea that his birth mother is a bear. And one day he happens to be hunting in the woods where Callisto is living. And Callisto sees Arcus, and she's thrilled. She knows immediately that it's her son, and she runs towards him, forgetting that she's in the form of a bear. And Arcas, of course, has no idea that his mother's a bear, so he sees a bear charging at him, and he says, I'm going to hunt this bear. I'm not afraid. So he grabs his javelin, he prepares himself to throw this javelin straight through the bear's heart. Now, luckily for both of them, Zeus is sitting on top of Mount Olympus and witnesses this, and he decides to turn Arcas into a bear. He grabs both bears by their short, stubby tails and begins to spin them. And as he spins them, their tails stretch and stretch and stretch, and he throws them up into the night sky to become constellations, where they will be safe from Hera. So Callisto and her son Arcas end up as Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, safe from the wrath of Hera, and they get together forever. So it's a pretty happy ending. Now, I want you to keep in mind the idea of Zeus taking on the form of something else to seduce a young woman, because that's going to be kind of a theme throughout our discussion. So keep that in mind. But while we're thinking about that, let's talk about another famous son of Zeus, and that is Hercules. So Hercules is probably the most famous half-mortal son of Zeus. There's so many mythology, there's so many myths about him, so many stories. There's been movies and TV shows, so I'm sure you've all heard the name Hercules before. You probably have some ideas of why he was famous. But Hercules wasn't always the hero that we hear in stories. So just like Callisto and Arcas, Hera hated Hercules for being the result of one of Zeus's infidelities, and she wanted to punish Hercules. So she sent down a curse of insanity on Hercules. And in the throes of this curse, Hercules slaughtered his wife and children. Now, when he eventually awoke from this curse, he was horrified. He had murdered his wife and children. He was heartbroken. He didn't really know what to do, so he went to the oracle at Delphi and pleaded with the oracle, tell me what I can do to redeem myself for this horrible act. And the oracle at Delphi said to go to the king of Mycenae, and he would give Hercules several tasks to perform to redeem himself. So that's what Hercules did. He went to the king of Mycenae, and initially the king gave him 10 tasks. And you're probably saying to yourself, wait a second, I thought it was 12 Herculean tasks. Well, it ended up being 12, but it started off as 10. And actually, many of these 10 have constellations associated with them. So the first thing that Hercules had to do was he had to go and slay the Nemean Lion. So this was a lion who had magic fur. It was impenetrable to human weapons, which made him incredibly tricky to kill. So this lion was just hanging out, eating cows, eating chickens, because why hunt antelope and gazelle and zebra when you can easily steal farmers' livestock? The farmer can't kill him, so the lion was pretty lazy, and he just ate livestock all day long. And obviously the farmers in the area really hated this lion. They really wanted him gone. So Hercules' job was to figure out a way to kill this lion. Now, luckily for Hercules, he was blessed with super strength. That was one of the things that he got out of being a half god. So what he did was he waited for the lion and then snuck up on him, threw his arms around his neck, and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until he strangled the lion. And then, very cleverly, Hercules used the lion's own claws to skin him. And he made a very, very fancy cloak out of this lion's hide that he was able to use basically as armor because it was impenetrable to human weapons. Now, the lion got to be immortalized as a constellation, and we know him as Leo the lion. So up in the night sky, Leo is the Nemean lion that Hercules had to defeat. Now, Hercules' second task was to go and kill the many-headed Hydra. And while he was doing this, Hera decided she wanted to distract him. Because, of course, Hera hated Hercules. She did not want him to finish these tasks. So she sent a giant crab to distract Hercules while he was killing the Hydra. But luckily for Hercules, between his super strength and his cleverness, he was able to defeat both the Hydra and the giant crab, both of whom were immortalized in the night sky. So we have the constellation Hydra, and we have the constellation Cancer the Crab. Now I'm going to skip over the next several tasks because there aren't any constellations associated with them, but I encourage you to look up the stories behind those tasks because they're very interesting. So we're going to go to the penultimate task, the 11th task. Now, when Hercules completed the original 10 tasks, the king of Mycenae decided that he was going to trick Hercules and add 2 more tasks because he was basically working for Hera and didn't want Hercules to complete these tasks. So he added 2 more that he thought would be impossible. The first was to steal a golden apple off of Hera's apple tree. So Hera had this apple tree that she had planted on the top of Mount Atlas, and it grew golden apples. Now, the apple tree was protected by the Hesperides, who were the daughters of Atlas. Atlas, of course, was the great Titan whose job it was to hold up the sphere of the earth. He held it on his back. So the Hesperides, his daughters, were guarding this apple. But Hera wasn't sure that they were going to be enough. So she also sent a dragon called Ladin to go guard the apples as well. So Hercules had to fight this dragon to be able to get to the golden apples. And it was a mighty battle, very epic, but eventually Hercules won out, and he killed the dragon and stole a golden apple. Hera, to recognize Ladin the dragon, sent him up into the night sky to become the constellation Draco. And when we see Draco and Hercules up in the night sky, it looks as if Hercules is kneeling on Draco's head. So Hercules is in a kneeling position right above or below, depending on which perspective you're looking at it, the constellation Draco. Now, our last task also doesn't have a constellation, so we'll move on. But again, I encourage you to do some digging, to read some mythology, and find out about that last task on your own. Now, I mentioned that our Big Dipper is not an actual constellation. We call it an asterism. Another well-known asterism that we can see this time of year from the greater Cincinnati area is the Summer Triangle. And this is one of my favorite asterisms because it's incredibly easy to find. The 3 stars that make it up are really, really bright. They're pretty close together, and it very much looks like a triangle. So it's easy to find. And the stars that make it up are called Altair, Deneb, and Vega. Now, Deneb, which is part of Cygnus the Swan, is one of my favorite stars in the night sky because it is the most distant star that we can see with our naked eye, and it's still incredibly bright. I also like Deneb because it's part of Cygnus the Swan, and I love Cygnus because it's one of those constellations that I think actually looks like what it's supposed to. There are so many constellations that don't really look like what they're supposed to, including, I think, Hercules. If you remember Hercules when I pulled him up, it's kind of a square shape with some squiggles. Doesn't really look like a mighty warrior, mighty hero. But Cygnus, to me, actually looks like a swan. You can see the long neck, the wings, and then Deneb makes up the tail feathers. Now, Cygnus actually has a pretty good myth associated with it, and it goes back to what I had said about our theme for the evening, which is Zeus turning into various different things to seduce young women. So Cygnus is actually one of Zeus's forms. So there was a lovely young woman named Leda, and Zeus fell in love with her. And for whatever reason, he decided that he was going to seduce her in the form of a swan. So Zeus would often take on the forms of animals or objects or other people so that Hera would not notice his dalliances. So in this case, Zeus decided to become a swan, and he was such a magnificent swan, and Leda felt oddly compelled by him, and she ended up having relations with him. And because Zeus had been in the form of a swan at the time, Leda laid an egg. That's right, she laid an egg. I'm telling you, the Greeks were maybe some weird people, but that's how the myth goes. She and Zeus had intimate relations while he was a swan, and then she laid an egg. And out of the egg hatched the Gemini Twins, her 2 sons that she named Pollux and Castor. Now, Pollux and Castor were incredibly close. They grew up doing everything together. But there was one minor issue, and that was that Pollux was immortal, while Castor was not. So it wasn't much of an issue until the 2 of them attended their cousin's wedding. Now, as luck would have it, their cousins were twins, and they were marrying, you guessed it, twins. Now, Castor and Pollux, upon meeting their cousins' fiancés, instantly fell in love with them, and they decided they were going to run off with these girls, even though they were supposed to marry their cousins. Now, when the cousins found out, a huge family brawl broke out, and unfortunately in the fighting, Castor was accidentally killed, and Pollux was beside himself. He had lost his brother, his best friend, he didn't know what to do, and he started traveling the earth, trying to find ways to kill himself. But he couldn't because he was immortal. All he wanted was to be with his brother again, but he just couldn't achieve it. So Zeus came to Pollux and gave him two options. The first option was to let go of his mortal half and to join Zeus and the other Olympians on Mount Olympus. So essentially, Pollux would get to become a god. The second option is that Pollux could choose to become a constellation with his brother Castor. And because Pollux loved Castor so much, he decided to go with option 2. So he chose not to become a mighty god on Mount Olympus and to rather get to be beside his brother for all of eternity. Now, Castor and Pollux we don't see this time of year, but we do see their mother or their father in the form of Cygnus the swan. But to talk about some constellations that we do see this time of year, two of my favorites are this one that looks to me like the shape of a W, named Cassiopeia, and then this other one that to me looks like the shape of a house, named Cepheus. Now, Cassiopeia and Cepheus are not actually a W and a house, even though, let's be real, that's what they look like. They are a mighty king and queen. So Cassiopeia is the queen, Cephas is her husband, the king, and they were the king and queen of a mythical country in northern Africa called Ethiopia. Not Ethiopia, Ethiopia. And they were a pretty good king and queen with one exception, and that is that Cassiopeia was incredibly vain. She thought that she was the most drop-dead gorgeous woman that had ever lived, and she would tell anyone about it. And she made one fatal mistake. She decided to tell everyone that both she and her daughter Andromeda were more beautiful than the sea nymphs, who just so happened to be the daughters of Poseidon, king of the sea. And just like all of the other Olympians, Poseidon had a vengeful side, and when he heard that Cassiopeia had been bragging that she and her daughter were more beautiful than his daughters, he was furious. How dare a mere mortal compare herself, nay, elevate herself above his daughters? It was unthinkable, so Poseidon decided that Cassiopeia had to be punished, and so he sent Cetus, the great sea monster, to ravage the coastline of Ethiopia. So Cetus was attacking any ships coming to or from Ethiopia, so they couldn't conduct any trade. He was pulling entire villages right off of the coastline into the ocean. And Cassiopeia and Cepheus were beside themselves. They loved their country. They wanted to be good rulers. And obviously, their country was going to be destroyed by this sea monster. So they went to the temple of Poseidon and prayed to Poseidon and said, please, we will do anything. We will do anything to make amends to you and to get Cetus to leave us alone. Well, Poseidon said, there is one thing that you can do. There's one thing that will pacify Cetus. If you take your beautiful daughter Andromeda and you chain her to a rock in the ocean, and you allow Cetus to ravage and eat her, then he will leave your country alone. Well, Cephas and Cassiopeia were beside themselves. They loved their daughter very much, but they also loved their country, and they decided that the only option was to go ahead and chain Andromeda to the rocks. That's what they did. And they left because they couldn't bear to watch their only daughter eaten by a sea monster. Now, poor Andromeda, she's chained to this rock, awaiting her fate. But luckily for her, it just so happened that at that exact moment, Perseus was sailing by. Talk about the most perfect timing ever. I mean, 1 in a billion chance, right? So Perseus is a famous Greek hero, and it just so happened that he was coming back from killing the Gorgon Medusa. So he sees Andromeda change the rock, and he's horrified. He can't believe that this sea monster is about to eat this beautiful princess. So he cries out to all of his sailors, "Cover your eyes!" And they do. They all cover their eyes, and he pulls out the head of Medusa that he has taken for a prize. And Medusa was famous for turning anyone who looked at her into stone. So Cetus looks at Medusa, instantly turns to stone, and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And Perseus rescues Andromeda, marries her, and they live happily ever after. And they all get to be up into the night sky as constellations, all there together. Now, Cassiopeia, though, has one form of payment for being so vain. So the gods decided that she needed to be punished just a little bit for being so incredibly vain. So for part of the year, she makes the shape of a W, and she is sitting beautifully on her throne, radiating beauty down on earth. But for the other portion of the year, she is shaped like an M, and she must cling to the bottom of her throne as her skirts fly up around her head, and she's so embarrassed. So that's Cassiopeia's great punishment for her vanity, is to have to cling to her throne upside down for portions of the year. Now, when we look up in the night sky, sometimes the stars we see are actually planets. And believe it or not, it's very easy to tell the difference. You don't even need a telescope. So if you remember when you were a wee child, you probably learned a song about stars. It goes something like, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Well, it's not just a fun, catchy song. It's also teaching us how to tell the difference between a star and a planet, because stars twinkle while planets don't. And that's because stars emit their own light. So that light pulses, it changes, and it twinkles, whereas planets reflect light instead of producing it. And so it's a steady light. So if you look up in the night sky and you see an object that is not twinkling, then it's a star. It's not a star, it's a planet. Now, there are two planets that we can very, very easily see this summer from the greater Cincinnati, northern Kentucky area. And the first of those is Saturn. Now, it's not just the constellations that have mythology. The planets are all named after mythical figures as well. So most of the planets are named after the Roman version of Greek gods and titans, and Saturn is no exception. So Saturn is the Roman name for Cronus, who was the father of Zeus. So Cronus was one of the titans. He was the son of Uranus and Gaia. Fun fact, Uranus is the only planet whose name is the Greek version. So Uranus and Gaia were two of the original titans, and Cronus was their son. And Cronus had overthrown his father and taken power. And at first, Cronus was a good ruler, but then things changed because he heard a prophecy that one of his children was going to overthrow him the same way he had overthrown his father. And so he decided the only option was to eat his children. So every time his wife Rhea gave birth, Cronus would eat the baby. Now, this happened 5 times, and Rhea finally got fed up. She was like, "I don't want him to eat any more of my children." So she went to Gaia, Mother Earth, and the two of them hatched a plan. And when she gave birth to her 6th child, Zeus, instead of giving Cronus, aka Saturn, Zeus, she gave him a rock wrapped in some swaddling clothes. Now, apparently Saturn was not particularly smart because he didn't notice it was a rock and not a baby, and he ate it. And eventually Zeus grew up, and he came to Saturn as his cupbearer and brought him what Saturn, aka Cronus, thought was a cup of wine, but was in fact a potion to induce vomiting. So Saturn drank it and threw up all of Zeus's brothers and sisters, and together they were able to defeat Cronus and fling him down into Tartarus, which is the Greek underworld. And so then we have Jupiter, who is named for Zeus. So Zeus helped defeat his father and became the king of the gods. And because he is the king of the gods, our largest planet is named after him, Jupiter. So Zeus is the Greek version, Jupiter is the Roman version. Now, one of the cool things about Jupiter is that if you look at it through a large telescope, well, even a portable telescope, you can see its 4 largest moons. We call them the Galilean moons because they were discovered by Galileo, so that makes sense. And those 4 large moons are named Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, Callisto, that name sounds familiar. Right, because that's Ursa Major. We were already talking about how Zeus, Jupiter, had seduced her. And it turns out the other 3 moons all have mythology tied to Zeus, aka Jupiter, as well. So we already know the story of Callisto and Zeus and Ursa Major. But Io was another young woman that Zeus fell in love with. And he came to Io in the form of a cloud. And when Hera found out about his infidelity with Io, she turned Io into a white heifer, a cow. And to prevent Zeus from being able to turn her back, she chained her to a tree and sent a 100-eyed dog to guard her. Now, Zeus was pretty clever. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down, and Hermes distracted the dog by telling it a story. He told it a story and played his lyre, and the dog eventually fell asleep and closed all 100 of its eyes. And they were able to free Io, who was still a cow at that point, but Hera was so incensed that she sent down a gadfly to bite and sting Io. And so Io ran away because this fly was constantly stinging and biting her, and Io ran across the land until she eventually ended up in Egypt, where she was able to be transformed back into a human. And she bore Zeus several sons, who all founded famous cities in Egypt and Greece. So it turned out pretty well for her, and she gets to be one of Jupiter's moons. And then, of course, we have Europa. Now, in the story of Io got turned into a cow. But when we talk about Jupiter and Europa, or Zeus and Europa, it's Zeus who's in the form of a cow, or rather a bull. So to seduce Europa, Zeus turned into a snow white bull with jeweled horns. And this bull was so beautiful that Europa just could not stop herself from petting it. And the bull was so soft and so docile that Europa decided to climb on its back. And as soon as she was on Zeus's back, he took off. He ran across land, across sea, and he brought Europa to the island of Crete. Now, many misadventures happened with Europa's brothers as they all came trying to find her, but everyone ended up happily ever after, and Europa started culture on Crete, and she gets to be a Jupiter moon. Now, our last moon of Jupiter here, Ganymede, is a little bit of a different story because Ganymede was not a beautiful young woman that Zeus seduced. Rather, he was a beautiful young man. So Ganymede was a beautiful youth living on Earth, and Zeus saw him from Mount Olympus and decided to make him the cupbearer to the gods. So this was a pretty good gig for Ganymede because he got to come live on Mount Olympus and serve wine to all of the gods. And to basically be a god himself. And everything was going very well. Ganymede made an excellent cupbearer, but unfortunately for Ganymede, Zeus was not picky in his conquests, and Zeus began to show quite the interest in Ganymede. And that would have been fine, except Hera, of course, noticed this. And so Zeus decided to turn Ganymede into a constellation to prevent Hera from exacting any wrath upon him. And so Ganymede became Aquarius, the water bearer. And also gets to be Ganymede, the moon of Jupiter. So those are the 4 moons of Jupiter, all named after famous myths that have something to do with Zeus, aka Jupiter. Now, there are tons of other constellations up in the night sky, including many from other cultures, and I encourage you guys to find out more about those. And if you would like to learn more about astronomy or space, the observatory reopened July 1st, and we're offering limited daytime tours of the observatory, and we're also offering tons of virtual programs. So if you visit our website, you can learn more about all of the different ways that you can interact with the observatory. Well, I hope you all learned a little something new today, and I challenge you guys to see if you can find some of these constellations up in the night sky. If you would like your own star map, you can visit skymaps.com, and they provide free star charts month to month. So you can put in your location and you can print out a star map and use it to help you find some of the constellations we talked about. I would recommend starting with Cassiopeia and Cepheus, as they are pretty easy to find. The Summer Triangle as well, very, very easy to find. Well, keep looking up and good luck finding those constellations. Thank you all for joining me.